All right. And now for our next speaker, we have Ben Kreimer, a creative technologist, who's going to talk about making collaborative futures. Thank you.
So my name is Ben Kreimer, and Robert Hernandez took this with his structure sensor, I don't know, 8 years ago. So Robert, wherever you are, thank you for that. But I'm a creative technologist. I'm a journalism technologist. The more so I use the word creative because my work, hey, Robert, remember that when you took that scan in my head? Anyway, so I've been working in the media landscape. I was a Forbes 30 under 30 5 years ago. And my interest, which is really how I lead in the work that I do, has been on pursuing emerging media technologies, emerging media platforms, and finding enduring applications for these novel and innovative technologies, not just sort of novelty one-offs. And so there we go. Okay. So my underlying principles that I work by consistently, work that I do is always mission or story driven. Technology is just a tool, and there's a lot of them, a lot of different tools, a lot of tech tools. Interdisciplinary work and exploration is very critical, and that's this whole collaborative futures concept, which I'll get into more in a minute, is really about that, as well as frugal innovation. Less thinking, more making, and more doing. So just getting your hands dirty and doing stuff. And I've worked with a lot of different teams and a lot of different projects doing stuff. This is a selection of different entities that I've done projects with over the years. University of Nebraska. So I was a student at the University of Nebraska when Gary was dean, and he hired this cowboy of a data journalist, Matt Waite, and I mean that in the most loving way. He's a great guy, and he's also a wild man. And he started PolitiFact, won the Pulitzer Prize for that, started the Drone Journalism Lab, which I got involved in very early on. And he was a very early mentor. So thank you, Gary. And that's kind of how I ended up here, going way back now. So collaborative futures is this process that in some ways it started in the way that I was working with Matt in the Drone Journalism Lab. And it's kind of evolved and meandered its way into this practice that I'm going to talk about. Because I think when doing sort of work that is considered innovative and looking to the future, there's certain sort of elements. There's like a recipe that I've started to sort of follow in some ways without even realizing it. So there's a practice that involves projects. So I'll show examples of projects of what I'm talking about. Then we have the workshop model of the Collaborative Futures Workshop, which is a workshop that a colleague of mine and I did in Nairobi 2 years ago. And it's sort of like a workshop encapsulation of this practice that I'll talk more about. And Collaborative Futures is also an R&D team that features my co-conspirator Trevor Snap, who was an early virtual reality 360-degree filmmaker with Nani de la Peña and the New York Times. And they did the We Who Remain VR piece in Sudan. So Collaborative Futures is a non-hierarchical and people-centric practice of sharing, learning, making across disciplines and perspectives. And as an example of what this means, because I like to show rather than just talk, one of the very early applications of drone technology that I got into right after finishing my bachelor's of journalism degree was working with a team of archaeologists. This was over 10 years ago now. And I still work with them. And I was brought on to do drone photography. So, Drone Journalism Lab, we were not just doing journalism projects, we were actually also doing archaeology and learning about how archaeologists can use drones. And we figured out something very early on, which is in this sort of shown in this video. So we started using photogrammetry. And so photogrammetry is basically a process whereby that's obviously a 3D reconstruction. it's a process whereby you take photographs and create a replica of something real. And at the time, this would have been about 2013, 2014, archaeologists had been doing this process for years and years. It's more of like a survey, a technique that's long been used for different surveying applications. So like in the mining industry, archaeology, et cetera. And what Matt and I realized was, why couldn't journalists who are now flying drones do photogrammetry to create three-dimensional models of the real world as a way of doing visual storytelling? And so that's one example that I like to use as a sort of collaborative futures example. It's, you know, starting in the journalism context, going over here to archaeology, learning something from specialists in archaeology, on, in this case, how to do photogrammetry, and then bringing it back to journalism. And so actually, Dan's student, Evan Jenkins, from 2015, 2016, he actually got involved. So with this, and what we did was kind of taking another step forward, which was at the time, virtual reality was becoming, or the latest wave of virtual reality was becoming a thing. And we took these three-dimensional models of this ancient Roman temple and put them into a virtual reality headset. And I have to admit that I had been having a conversation. At the time, there were some events happening at Columbia's Tau Center in New York. And I had this random conversation with one of the directors there. And we were talking about drones. And for some reason, I said, you know, I'm going to combine virtual reality and drones. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. And at the time, I had no idea what the context would be. I needed sort of a context to do that. And we kind of left it at that. And then a few months later, you know, this happened. And so it's like, oh, well, this is how we combine these technologies. But we needed that underlying context. It's like we had these tools, we had the drone, we had the photogrammetry and the virtual reality, but what was missing was that context to bring it all together. And so we did this, we made this happen. This is Collaborative Futures. And if you want to learn more about photogrammetry, which is now being kind of pushed aside by Gaussian splats and other kinds of AI forms of this kind of 3D modeling from imagery, I can't talk to you much about that, but if you want to learn about photogrammetry, there is a Knight Center journalism course about this from 2 years ago, which is free. And again, I recommend checking it out if you are interested in this kind of domain of 3D visual storytelling, because I also interview people in different disciplines. I interview an expert from Nepal who did a lot of surveying work around the earthquake a number of years ago there, and does a lot of humanitarian robotics work. I talked to people in Zanzibar who are working on a project mapping the entirety of Zanzibar. Nothing to do with journalism, actually, but their ideas do if you look at them through the journalistic lens, which is what happened in this course, in some of these interviews that we did. So trying to make collaborative futures that way. So bringing ideas to life at the intersections where people with different perspectives and lived experiences meet. This is kind of how I operate very consistently, and it's brought a lot of really interesting ideas and, you know, convenings and collaborations to life. And so this is not just about the tech either. And I think this is really important. And this really gets into the fact that people working in different disciplines, like working with artists. Sometimes I work with artists. Sometimes I work with, I actually been working with an architectural engineer from Georgia Tech, who's now a dean at Clemson. We've been doing a sort of web browser-based 3D curriculum teaching basic architectural engineering concepts. You know, working with these different teams, different people, everybody has different ways of working. They have different sort of challenges and different ideas and different things that they're trying to do. And there's a lot of cross-pollination that has been really fruitful. And learning also just how people work, which is kind of intangible, also comes out of these different experiences, and at the same time influences how do people work together. Collaboration is difficult in a lot of cases, and learning how to work together across silos can be a challenge. Now, I do like how technology is really about the sort of art and skill and cunning of hand. It's really not just about the screens around us. And I think remembering this, early on working with drones, it brought to mind sort of this sort of magic of the technology. And frankly, I think virtual reality did the same 10 years ago. And I think that there's really something to this, breadth that what technology can stand for, and that really it's kind of up to you to fill in the blank as to what it is that you're working on, but how these technologies can mean many different things, not just what we literally think of as technology. So that brings me to the Collaborative Futures Workshop. So the Collaborative Futures Workshop was a flat hierarchy workshop held in Nairobi, 2022. Everyone was an expert. Everyone had to share. And we had a really diverse range, pretty diverse range of people in the room: journalists, members of civil society groups, human rights defenders, artists, filmmakers. And what we did was we had everybody present. So normally, or oftentimes at a workshop, you'll have sort of the experts on a subject matter. They go up and they present the work that they're doing. In this case, everybody was an expert. Everybody had to present. They were short presentations, and they really just needed to cover, what are you working on and what kinds of challenges are you having? And it was a pretty small workshop, so everybody could do this. There were fewer people than in this room. And what came out of it was a lot of experimentation, a lot of working on story ideas. We had sort of three, and I will admit they were sort of in the most literal sense, technical teams involved. And part of the second day was spent on these different civil society organizations and artists going off into groups to try to make a sort of project, basically, in the span of an afternoon. And so there was a VR 360 video project. There was a lot of sticky note and paperwork happening, figuring out how to use civic data and mapping. There was a mapping team from Nairobi called Spatial Collective that does a lot of urban data work in Nairobi. And the whole idea was just to throw ideas at the wall and to get people talking and thinking and working together, and to find those intersections, with the idea being that people would leave not only with new network connections, but actual seeds of ideas for projects that could be executed. And like I said, we also had a contingent from Sudan, some activists from Sudan who were there as well, including a muralist. And this was a time in Sudan's history. If you're familiar with what's going on right now, there's a war, a terrible war happening. And before that war, there was a revolution and this sort of movement towards a civilian-led, government of some form. And before that, there was a revolution. And during the revolution, you had artists like Me&You here in the street painting in Sudan. So Me&You was there. And that was the Collaborative Futures Workshop. And it was a great success in the way that afterwards, numerous of these creatives, these civil society groups, these human rights defenders have stayed in touch, have done projects, and we're still in the process of getting more of these projects moving based on ideas that came out of this event 2 years ago. So there is but this, this brings up something, which is why and how does a white guy like me do this work? Like, how am I positioned in these parts of the world where I like to work, where I gravitate towards, especially when the subject of decolonization is happening. It's happening in different ways, in different places. And I think this is really important because there's this act of decolonization is a very ongoing and a very pressing and urgent and just, it's an of the moment scenario that's playing out. And I've been a part of, this in literal ways, but also trying to figure out what is my role in these places, doing these kinds of projects. And so this is kind of a rehashing of what I was saying earlier about crossing boundaries. So yeah, new possibilities and ideas arise when you're engaging with people, when you're crossing these boundaries of countries, of different knowledge silos. And sure, there can be an endless source of new ideas and innovation. However, a lot of these boundaries that we're crossing, there's a lot of hierarchies, there's inequities, there's historical colonial power dynamics, knowledge systems sort of conflicting with each other, overriding one another, and it can get messy. And this kind of came up in a class that I was co-teaching at the Johnny Carson Center for Emerging Media Arts at the University of Nebraska. And we were doing a class about this community, Seabreeze, North Carolina, which was historically during the Jim Crow era. This is where Black families would go to hang out, to go on vacation when they were not allowed at the white areas around the state on the coast. And so this area, which it still exists in a way, though I think it was just flooded out during the recent hurricane, flooded out again. A lot of the land is owned by a single family. And this dates back to this era, this Jim Crow era. And the land is tied up in an heirs property situation. So if you're familiar with heirs property, to really oversimplify it, it's basically where a generation, say, grandparents do not follow proper sort of proper legal procedure to pass down to the next generation the titles to land. And so this happens a lot in the South, related to farmland, related to land that was used in some sort of economic way. And so what happens is a family will sort of kind of inherit land, but without the proper paperwork, which means that they basically don't have the ability to exploit that land for their economic gain. And it becomes a real difficult challenge for them to sort of recertify that, this is our land. And you can read, there's been many stories about this heirs property situation. And Seabreeze, the family that owns a lot of the land, is experiencing this process, or going through this process right now. And it can take years. And families like this tend to get exploited by land developers who can sort of bypass normal legal routes and sort of they can sort of force a sale basically at under market value and just kind of rip off the family. If one uncle who's a jerk, he can make this sale happen and everybody else will lose. And so this is a problem, and this family's trying to do something about it. And one way that you go about this in the legal way is you have to present the story of your family and the land. And there's a lot of storytelling involved in the most literal sense to establish your case in the legal context. And part of it too involves you have to present a case as to how you're going to use the land in the future. So we had a class at UNL that was an undergraduate class working on doing that. It's like we were a class, there were a class of undergrad emerging media experts, filmmakers, 360 video producers, drone operators. And we traveled to North Carolina. And the idea was to do field work, to work with the family, to prepare this story, to help them sort of gather documentation. And there was an issue, and the students had everything kind of came to a head one day in the classroom where there was this deep concern that, and you have to understand, this is Midwestern Nebraska. Most of the students were white, and they felt very uneasy doing this work. They felt uneasy working with this Black family. They did not feel that they were in the position to be working on this project. And they basically said, we're not going to do it. And so we spent most of class that day talking about what's going on. Like, why are you thinking, like, why are you making this case? And my argument was that I understood their concern. They did not want to be canceled, which is one of the words that they used. And my point was everything that, they're saying is right, except this is how we move forward in this challenging, really difficult to navigate situation. You have to navigate it. You can't just say, I'm not going to touch it, because the family was inviting them in. I said, you're being invited in as experts to help. They want you to help. And my point was, if you listen, you can navigate and figure out how to make this future where this kind of racial, decolonization, being canceled situation is more balanced out. And inevitably, it did work out, and the students got engaged. The family was extremely appreciative of all the different projects that came out for them. And I think it was a really interesting situation. And I think it showed how delicate these situations can be, but how important they are in this point in time, when you have people from different backgrounds, different races, different parts of the world, different socioeconomic situations coming together, and you got to navigate it somehow. And especially if you're able to listen, and if you're invited to be a part of what's going on, then you take it. You have to, because people on my side, on our side, are like, we were the problem, and we have to be part of the solution moving forward. So in a completely different international context, part of my attitude about this, and I think this goes into the collaborative futures sort of values, is that there is something to be said about the outside perspective. My father was a Fulbrighter twice in India, and he has an enormous appreciation for the wedding bands that play in the streets in northern India. And he came in as an artist, filmmaker, and just a lover of the bands. And there were a couple times of Indian news stories about his work. This was back in 2013. And in the comments online, the comments were surprisingly all positive. And a lot of them had to do with this notion of sort of this outsider coming in and showing a different angle to this story of the bands. And the bands in India, unless you're in the band, and these processions, they're like miniature parades where they push, in many cases, a cart, or there's a slow driving truck with a massive sound system. They make a lot of noise. They clog up the streets. People, if you're not in the band, if you're not in the wedding party, you don't like them because they're a nuisance. And what people were saying in the comments, like some of these that I pulled out, are that, look at this. We have this outsider who comes in with this completely different perspective, showing us a different perspective. And this is what I'm talking about as part of this, decolonization and collaborative futures process. The problem is that this tends to only happen in this one direction. It's like people from here go to India, say. It doesn't happen enough in the opposite direction. And that needs to happen. I think we need more. We can always use more of these kinds of perspectives of people who come from the outside to show us our own reality in a different way. And so I think that's one of the limitations and one of the issues that we're dealing with right now in this way. So I'll jump now to Sudan. This is a project that I've been working on as a consultant, helping technologically. It's the Sudan Human Rights Hub. And basically, we've created a collaborative archive platform. So here's the deal. There's the war happening in Sudan. There are human rights abuses happening. And there is a lot of social media posts happening, showing what's going on the ground. And what this team is trying to do is to scrape as fast as they can, as much of this social media, this open source media as they can, to save it, to advocate for the people of Sudan. And this is a Sudanese team doing this work. They're now distributed around the world, but basically we've built this archive platform, and it's designed to store all this open source media before it gets deleted, before it gets lost. And we have an ontology, the data is classified based on dates, events, what is shown in the media. And So we have different teams of people. There are different grassroots organizations that are able to contribute to this collaborative archive system. They're able to use their mobile devices and laptops, and the data all goes to the cloud. And we've got a web form, and more interestingly, I think we have a WhatsApp chatbot. And so when we started doing this archiving work, when the war broke out, April of last year, we needed a way to reach people and to engage people as fast as we could, meet people where they're at, and people are on WhatsApp. And so we built a chatbot, which I think I might be using my way. When I say chatbot, I have to be clear. There's no AI involved with this. This is purely a system that has been programmed to deliver basically a web form. And that's what's going on here. So we have basically a web form where the Sudan Human Rights Hub monitors can go and submit media that they're seeing online using this automated chatbot system. And we're using the turn.io WhatsApp Business API system to basically to create the WhatsApp chatbot and to run it. Sudan Shaheed is a collaborative, which I'll get to in a moment. But so we're using turn.io, we're using the WhatsApp Business API. It's really designed for businesses. And turn.io is interesting because it's not business oriented, it's nonprofit oriented. So they work with different humanitarian groups around the world. Basically, they're using this WhatsApp Business API, which you can only access through these sort of intermediaries like Twilio. So that's how we build our bots. There's code involved like this that's based on the Turn.io system itself. So this is unique. What you see here is basically how we develop specifically in Turn.io. And yeah, why WhatsApp? It's because everybody's on WhatsApp in Sudan. So this is a way that we can engage people without creating more hurdles to this monitoring process. And so again, then the data can go back out to the different groups that are involved. We created, our web infrastructure involves Amazon Web Services for storing data, the scraped media, the scraped photos, videos, et cetera. We have this archive manager tool, sort of like a player to play that media. And then we had the spreadsheet, which I showed earlier, using NoCoDB as our I guess, database tool. And so we've had, 22,000 entries since April 15th when the war started, 2023. And we get about 500 entries per week, but only at this point, about a fifth to a quarter of those entries are actually from WhatsApp. A lot of people now are using the web form. Oops. And this is, a lot of the projects that I work on are kind of on the periphery of journalism. So like we have the Center for Investigative Reporting as a partner in this Sudan Shaheed project. And Sudan Shaheed is basically this. It's this map that shows the data that's going into that database that I just showed. It gets visualized and mapped on this website here, which is run by C4ADS. So news chatbots. I want to pay my respect to the continent. If you're not familiar with the continent, you should definitely check it out. What they do is really, they're really doing something unique on the African continent as far as publishing WhatsApp native news. Now, but I do want to say, I think it's interesting how they follow this sort of digital newspaper model where, when you sign up for the continent, you'll get a message periodically asking if you want to receive your newspaper. And the newspaper is a PDF that you receive through WhatsApp. So, my thought originally was, well, why send people a PDF that's basically a newspaper PDF? Like, why not make it more native to WhatsApp? So there's different ways that you can do this. And we've been experimenting with the ION network, which I showed a logo of. So I've been helping the ION network with some of their publishing challenges and reaching people on mobile devices. And one way that we've been looking at is, again, using WhatsApp. And And there's different ways you can do this. So for example, I mentioned turn.io. We are doing these experiments. They are just experiments. Nothing has been made public. I have no data to say this works, this does not, but I'll show you what we've been working on. So you can use actually RSS feeds to feed in data to the chatbot to automatically send out messages of stories. Now, you'll see that this RSS feed here or you'll see some of the RSS feed detritus that hasn't been cleaned out here. But basically, if you've got an RSS feed, you can automatically start shooting out content native into WhatsApp messages. And you can have lists of stories, and you can navigate around just like you would a chatbot experience. Again, there's no AI. This is as automated as we're getting so far is with using RSS. You can do the same with Facebook. If you have a Facebook group page, you can also basically have your Facebook connected to your chat bots so that you can send out stories and people can receive stories that are published posts on Facebook. They can receive directly in WhatsApp, which again, this is not ideal. The problem with both of these models, I think, is simply that basically you get a summary, but then you still get kicked out to a web page, to a URL. And so what I'm most interested in is the sort of WhatsApp native, is the sort of what I think of as a WhatsApp native news delivery, where literally the video piece is published so that you play it and it plays in WhatsApp. And the news story, the text is itself a WhatsApp message. There's no link to go to. You can instantly forward the news story, the video, the audio, because that's what people are doing anyway. They're forwarding in groups, to friends, to family. Content media is just flowing through WhatsApp. And so just getting the media, not sending people to a link, but it's all there. It's all there in WhatsApp. All you have to do is forward it. It's right there. So this is what I think is something that we really need to be pursuing more, but we're not. And to be fair, the reason is because most of the focus has been on the archive that I was showing earlier. So I think this is the last thing I'm going to show. This is a 360-degree camera trap. My background is really kind of in these hardware hack VR 360 projects. And this is kind of my bread and butter, which I just love working on. This is a 360 camera trap that I took to Botswana a year ago in the Okavango Delta. And the needs were simply, oh, I should mention Sam Wolson, if you know that name. He's at the New Yorker now. He's a virtual reality filmmaker who's been active over the years. So he was involved with this. Basically, we needed to build a camera that would do automated capture. So, you know, a camera trap works where you set it out on a tree or on the ground somewhere and an animal walks by and it sets it off. So we needed a 360 camera that would have automated capture that would just work on its own out in the field. It would work at night, and it has, of course, it had to shoot 360 video. And so what came out of that was this lunchbox-sized camera that has near-infrared LEDs, it has motion sensors, it has cameras that are made, or they're not, well, they're microscope cameras that have special low-light camera sensors. There's two of them, of course, with super fisheye lenses. And these cameras are actually designed to do also astrophotography. So they have you can actually shoot color video with moonlight. So they're unusual camera sensors. And there's the inside of my lunchbox. They're like little Pelican cases that I built these cameras into. And this was sort of a riff, or it was sort of recycled, which is another, you know, I think essential technique of taking old ideas and sort of reusing them. I had been involved in a project called Volume, doing volumetric video capture. So like holograms or moving 3D models, time-based 3D capture a number of years ago. And I borrowed the form factor for these volumetric cameras that would produce these sort of holograms, these 3D mesh holograms, and made this 360 camera. that's all, that's old, that's the volume work. But, you know, these cameras were put out in the Okavango Delta, and we're capturing hippos and elephants, and mostly, yeah, hippos and elephants. We were hoping to get a jaguar. So you know, there's a lot of wiring and Arduino work that went into this. So like this is the wiring schematic. It's a mess, but it worked. And I think that's always the key here is, you know, with open source technologies, there's a lot you can do. It's really quite amazing. And I'll end with this video, which was, yeah, this was shot on the Okavango Delta. And this was the sort of camera trap test. This is a 360 video, and I'm navigating it in a pre-recorded fashion, but yeah. And there is no sound. This was just the video capture. And that's a hippo, if you can't tell. There were two cameras. They both survived everything. One is still out there. So this was actually on an island in the Okavango, which is it's a river delta with all these little islands. And so we just set it up, walked away, and came back. I think this was just an overnight outing, but that's where I end this talk. Any questions? Volume is dead, but it could come back. Volumetric video, I mean, I was just meeting with Sam Wilson, and so we had the Volume team, which was a Journalism 360 funded project back in 2018, I think it was. And it could come back using what's available now. Everything has changed. The technology, you know, yeah. I'll leave it at that.